We begin with the oppressive heat gripping much of the country as Americans across the country saw more record-breaking heat over the weekend. 18 cities across the country set or tied record highs this weekend, including Newark, New Jersey, which saw a record 5 consecutive days at or above 100 degrees. And this morning, 41 million Americans are once again under heat alert. While some much needed relief appears to be on the way today for the Northeast, for the Midwest, you're looking at the West Coast and Pacific Northwest. They're expected to see dangerously hot weather this week, beginning today, with highs topping out at more than 100 degrees in some areas. And in California, those dry, hot conditions fueling the state's biggest wildfire this year, the Oak Fire near Yosemite National Park, burning out of control, forcing thousands of people to evacuate. We have full coverage of all of it this morning, including the latest on that fire. NBC News reporter Gary Grombach is in D.C. with record-setting heat in the Northeast, and meteorologist Michelle Grossman is ready with the forecast. Michelle, let's start with you. It sounds like the Northeast, as we said, it might catch a little bit of a break finally, but things are really warming up out west, right?
Yeah, you have it exactly right. Hi there, Kate. Yeah, we're going to see relief tomorrow in the Northeast. It's going to come at a price, and that's going to be some really strong storms later on this afternoon. We're watching a cold front that's going to move through, but we are looking at coast-to-coast heat because now the Pacific Northwest will see the heat this week. 41 million people impacted from the Pacific Northwest through the middle of the country, Oklahoma City, Little Rock, Jackson, and then Boston and Philadelphia. You have another hot day ahead of you before we see that relief come. So there's that coast-to-coast heat in terms of the numbers. We're looking at triple digits, 103 in Fresno, 97 in Portland today. Tulsa, you're going to feel like 107 when we factor in that humidity, feeling like 110 in Houston this afternoon, and it will feel like 105 in D.C. So it's going to be steamy and stormy in D.C. as we go throughout the afternoon hours. And then we stay so warm in parts of the south central states in the Pacific Northwest. Tomorrow, we're looking at 108, 100 degrees in Salt Lake City, 95 in Corpus Christi, and 103 in Dallas. Keeping it toasty, too, in Oklahoma City on Wednesday, 102. Triple digits for Spokane in Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Las Vegas, you will be into the triple digits, too, throughout most of this week. Now, here is the stormy part. We have a cold front that's going to be moving through. We had a tornado watch earlier this morning in Pacific Northwest, in the northwest portion of Pennsylvania, but we're looking at heavy downpours with this line of storms as well, and that will impact the mid-Atlantic, the I-95 corridor as we go throughout this afternoon into the evening hours. 53 million people at risk. We're going to see winds gusting over 65 miles per hour. That could cause damage on its own and also some hail. So, Kate, we're looking from Bangor, Maine, all the way to Richmond, Virginia for the chance of some of these strong storms. Back to you.
All right, Michelle, thanks so much. And while the West Coast is bracing for that extreme heat, there is that state of emergency this morning in central California. Hot, dry conditions are fueling a massive wildfire, the Oak Fire, burning out of control just outside of Yosemite National Park. The flames forcing thousands to evacuate. NBC News national correspondent Miguel Almaguer has more.
Another wave of destruction. The Oak Fire more than doubling in size to 14,000 acres. Now the state's largest wildfire of the year, ravaging everything in its path.
The fire has gained exceptional acreage overnight.
Peak fire season hitting hard in the rural community of Mariposa. Over 6,000 forced to evacuate as Governor Gavin Newsom declares a state of emergency. With containment nowhere in sight, the billowing plumes of smoke are visible from outer space. These are the new sounds of summer. The crackling of bone-dry brush, the result of California's mega drought, promising more hellscapes ahead as temperatures keep rising. More than 2,000 firefighters working around the clock to beat back flames. But thousands of structures remain under threat. Crews spread too thin to stop all the homes from burning.
Oh, this is horrible.
Rodney McGuire captured this video as he lost it all. His family's home for generations gone, along with his collection of classic cars. All he has left is support from his neighbors.
I still haven't absorbed this. I got another 50 messages, and I've been just trying to get my strength back to even read them. I just don't know.
Another small community overmatched by towering infernos, just hoping for a break from forces out of their control. Miguel Almaguer, NBC News.
So hard. And in the eastern part of the country, temperature records, as we said, were broken this weekend. The nation's capital has really been feeling the heat, officially marking its hottest weekend of the year. NBC News correspondent Gary Grumbach is there for us. Gary, wow, it looks like you're staying a little cool in front of that fountain. Tell us about the latest in D.C. and the heat emergency plan in place there.
Kate, it was hot this weekend. It's going to be hot today. And in some parts of the country, it's going to be a very hot week. Here in D.C., we hit a real feel with included humidity, 103 degrees yesterday. That was the highest it was all weekend. And these heat emergencies and heat advisories, as you've said, have been hitting from Boston to St. Louis. Really, almost 90 million Americans this weekend saw a heat emergency. Now, in every city, what that means is something different. Here in D.C., what it meant is pools like this got to stay open for a few hours longer. It also means the city is throwing their resources behind opening up cooling centers and checking on the elderly and the homeless population across Washington, D.C. But it's not just D.C. We spoke to somebody in Dallas who said it's heat they haven't seen before.
You know, in the 21 years I've been here, we've definitely had hotter summers. So this one is, you know, it's right up there in the record books. We've seen cities open up their cooling centers. We've watched our neighbors, you know, control their water that they've used for their gardens. But really, it's just great to see people helping each other out.
Now, it is not just hot, it is record-breaking hot in some parts of the country. In Newark, as you mentioned, 101 degrees. Boston, Massachusetts saw 100. Kate?
And Gary, I know there's already been at least one heat-related death in New York over the weekend. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there was one heat-related death due to heat exposure in New York City. We're told that person had some pre-existing conditions. It's an important reminder to check on the folks that are elderly in your life. Check on your neighbors. Don't leave pets outside too long, and to stay hydrated during all of this heat.
And we said farther north and west, a prolonged heat wave is going to peak during the second half of the week. What are you hearing about cities that are preparing for the dangerous heat?
Yeah, they're doing very similar things, very similar to what Washington, D.C. did. They're opening up the cooling centers. They're extending pool hours. And it's the tips from experts that you hear all the time. Stay hydrated. Get to air conditioning if you can. If that means go to a cooling center, go to a cooling center. Call your 311 if you need to find a cooling center. But sources tell NBC News the best way to beat the heat, go to your local ice cream shop and enjoy some ice cream. Kate?
Or just jump in that pool right in front of you. Is there anyone there? Can you just do it?
That works too.
Okay, Gary, thank you. Appreciate it. Let's turn now to the monkeypox outbreak. The World Health Organization says the spread of monkeypox is a public health emergency of international concern. That's a major shift from the organization's stance just 1 month ago when the panel held back from giving the virus that designation. The general director says the WHO was unable to come to a consensus this weekend, forcing him to make the decision by himself. This is what he had to say.
We have an outbreak that has spread around the world rapidly through new modes of transmission, about which we understand too little and which meets the criteria in the international health regulations. For all of these reasons, I have decided that the global monkeypox outbreak represents a public health emergency of international concern.
This all comes as the Biden administration considers whether it will also declare a public health emergency here in the U.S. and after 2 cases of monkeypox have been reported in children by the CDC. Officials believe those cases were spread within households, but they're continuing to investigate that. Let's bring in NBC News medical contributor Dr. Kavita Patel for more on all of this. Dr. Patel, great to see you on a Monday morning. I think so many of us are wondering, how concerned should we be about monkeypox? It sort of feels like, what else is going to hit us? And also, who's vulnerable? And help us understand how it spreads.
Yeah, Kate, of course it feels like what else can happen to us on the heels of COVID and so many other things. Number one, I think we just need to have our awareness heightened. That's really critical. It's something that we can control, especially if people seek out testing, vaccination if appropriate. Getting to your point now, what to look for. What we're seeing is really interesting. The more common clinical syndrome that's been seen across the world previously has been a fever, some lymph node swelling kind of in your groin or in the neck area or armpits, having that flu-like feeling sounds very familiar, right? Then followed by a rash. There are many cases that are being reported, and some that I've seen, where we're seeing the rash first. Very painful rash. Can happen literally anywhere in the body, but more common areas are in the oral area around the mouth or in the extremities, the arms and hands. So if you have a rash that's just unusual, Kate, period, or if you've been in an area where you know that there's been somebody with monkeypox or heard about somebody with monkeypox, get tested. We now have testing that's widely accessible. Takes several days to get back, but it's something that we should keep on vigilance. In terms of high-risk groups, we have been really talking about groups that have had travel to areas, but that no longer is relevant, Kate. This is really everywhere. We're seeing community spread. So talk about high-risk behaviors. We talk about this certainly with gay, bisexual, and transgendered individuals who have had multiple sexual contacts, but I want to expand this. Again, thinking very broadly, this is a disease that is easy to spread, and it's something that happens with prolonged contact. So unusual rashes, unusual symptoms, just present yourself to a healthcare professional. We can test you.
And not to get too graphic here, but over the weekend you helped me understand that it's really about the rash or the body fluids, I guess, that are coming out of that rash, right? It's contact with that's the main reason it's spreading?
Yeah, this is really a prolonged contact. So let me just distinguish this from, for example, COVID or some other diseases that we've become, infections that we've become familiar with. It's not something from casually walking by somebody or even just casually touching a doorknob. This is something of prolonged contact. Think anywhere from hugging, kissing a household member, sharing common household items like toothbrushes or bedding or clothing. And then, again, sexual activity or just any contact, but it has to be with something that has usually a rash and usually some of that secretion, that kind of fluid that comes off of a rash.
Okay. The White House has been criticized for not moving quickly enough on this virus. Here's what the coronavirus response coordinator, Dr. Ashish Jha, had to say about the response.
I do think monkeypox can be contained, absolutely. The way we contain monkeypox is we have a very simple, straightforward strategy on this, right, which is make testing widely available. We have done that, and now testing is far more frequent and common.
It was slow.
Get vaccines out. Yeah, but we have right now the capacity to do 90,000 tests a week. I'm sorry, 80,000 tests a week. That's an extraordinary number. We're going to be releasing hundreds of thousands of more vaccines in the next days and weeks. So there is a very substantial ramping up of response that is happening right now.
Dr. Patel, is that all enough?
No, it's not enough. And certainly I would say two key actions the administration could take today, and the World Health Organization declaring a public health emergency will certainly help. Number one, we should be looking for other ways to consider surveillance. We did this with wastewater and COVID. We need something analogous to that. And then number two, we need to be pushing common sense information, things that you and I are discussing right now, Kate. We need to be pushing this to all Americans, including America's clinicians, because many of us are not aware of when and whom and how to look for this, and to think much broader. Don't just look in particular cities and areas. We should be looking for this everywhere and in very different forms than what might be studied in a textbook.
And just quickly, we've heard so much about this being spread by men having sex with men. And for some, that response, this whole response is sort of reminiscent of the AIDS pandemic in the 80s. Is there a comparison there?
There's a comparison in which we have unfortunately discriminated and might even limit access to testing, treatment, vaccines, and life-saving therapies. And I think that's absolutely on point, Kate. I think I lived through that, from calling it gay-related infectious disease to HIV to AIDS, and I do not want to see that carnage over again. Good news here is that the majority of cases are self-limited. That is good news now. We can contain it, and we can do it today.
Dr. Kavita Patel, always great to have you with us. Thanks so much. Let's get to the latest now in Washington. As President Biden recovers from his COVID diagnosis, Biden's physician said in a letter released yesterday that, quote, his symptoms continue to improve significantly and that, quote, his predominant symptom now is sore throat. The White House doctor also said the president continues to tolerate treatment well. We will continue Paxlovid as planned. NBC News correspondent Maura Barrett joins us now from Washington with the latest. So, Maura, good morning to you. What more can you tell us about the president's condition this morning? And is he going to have a full schedule from the White House today? Do we know?
Good morning, Kate. So this is day 4 of isolation for the president at the White House. And that sore throat that you mentioned is actually something that the doctor indicates in his letter is a good sign. He says it's a sign that the virus is clearing out of President Biden's body. And so over the weekend, we didn't see any photos or videos of the president. So that's something we'll definitely be looking for today. But we're told that he worked a little bit over the weekend as well as rested. We heard that he had worked 8+ hour days on Thursday and Friday last week. And the White House did release a schedule that he'll be receiving his daily briefing. That's obviously done in private, typically on his working days. And he's also going to be delivering virtual remarks to an organization of Black law enforcement executives today. It's unclear if we will see that on camera, but it is a sign that he will be working virtually. The other thing we learned from that letter from the doctor over the weekend is that the president most likely has that BA.5 variant. That's the one that's sweeping the country, infecting, causing nearly 80% of COVID cases right now. And so it's something that we're learning from research is more resistant to antibodies from vaccines. But experts are telling me, doctors emphasizing that even when you're vaccinated, double boosted, like the president was, it's a good thing that he had that protection, because even though he got infected, that could be what's preventing him from getting hospitalized or anything worse.
Yeah, it's a good message. Maura, let's switch gears and let's talk about the fallout from the January 6th hearings. Are they having an impact on former President Trump's support within the Republican Party? And looking ahead, could we see potential challengers against Trump emerging for 2024?
There absolutely has been an impact, which is kind of interesting to see, because as I'm talking to Republican voters, a lot of people find the January 6th hearings are not something that they're interested in watching. But the former president is. He's been watching it. He's been reacting on social media, his version of social media, and he's been talking about it at rallies. We saw him over the weekend in Arizona talking about it. And new polling actually late last week shows that 1/3 of Republicans want nothing to do with him and talking about the hearings. They're not encouraged by his message. Looking backwards, quite frankly, he's concerned about the 2020 election, whether it was fair, and what these hearings show. And so that could be really dangerous for him.
All right, Maura Barrett, thanks so much. Appreciate it. On Meet the Press Sunday, former Vice President Al Gore talked about the Biden administration's efforts to combat climate change. Plus, a House January 6th committee member called on the Justice Department to open a criminal investigation into former President Donald Trump. Here are some of the highlights.
Good morning on this week's Meet the Press, the climate crisis. I spoke with former Vice President Al Gore as dangerous heat waves spread across the globe. Plus, the January 6th committee details former President Trump's refusal to stop the violence at the Capitol that day. I spoke with Congresswoman Elaine Luria, member of the committee, about those 187 minutes. And finally, the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, joined us to discuss inflation and whether we should brace for a recession. Here are some of the most important answers from Meet the Press, compressed. Let's talk about the issue, though, that I think is probably the biggest challenge, and that is political will. And it's not just in this country. How, if the United States can't be a global leader here, who will?
The United States must step up and provide leadership. And of course, President Biden's been trying to do that. He has a 50-50 Senate, really a 49-51 Senate on everything related to the climate. And a razor-thin majority in the House. You know, the climate deniers are really in some ways similar to all of those almost 400 law enforcement officers in Uvalde, Texas, who were waiting outside an unlocked door while the children were being massacred. They heard the screams, they heard the gunshots, and nobody stepped forward. And God bless those families who've suffered so much. And law enforcement officials tell us that's not typical of what law enforcement usually does. And confronted with this global emergency, what we're doing with our inaction and failing to walk through the door and stop the killing is not typical of what we are capable of as human beings.
Public sentiment on climate is certainly in some ways growing more urgent. And you've made notice that rank and file Republicans are growing more concerned about the climate. But, you know, public opinion is on one side on abortion, is on one side on guns, is on one side on climate. And yet you see that it hasn't mattered to some of the decisions that are made in our politics. How do you break through this?
Well, you're exactly right, and public sentiment is changing, but our democracy is broken. And in order to solve the climate crisis, we're going to have to pay attention to the democracy crisis.
The Justice Department, are you seeing any signs? I know you've been among those frustrated about what appears to be a lack of a criminal investigation. Do you see any signs that one's been opened?
I sure as hell hope they have a criminal investigation at this point into Donald Trump. I have no direct knowledge of the status of their investigations, but what I'd say is, I can tell the Department of Justice is watching our hearings closely. So, Merrick Garland has already told us he's listening, and if he's watching today, I'd tell him he doesn't need to wait on us, because I think he has plenty to keep moving forward.
What's the number you're most focused on that will give you a better indication of where this economy is headed?
What a recession really means is a broad-based contraction in the economy. And even if that number is negative, we are not in a recession now. And I would, warn that we should be not characterizing that as a recession.
Some of the highlights from Meet the Press are thanks to Chuck Todd for those interviews this week. By the way, the Fed is expected to announce another interest rate increase on Wednesday, trying to tame inflation. We'll be keeping a close eye on that. And also Thursday's release of the U.S. GDP for the second quarter. It could show negative growth in the U.S. for the second straight quarter, which economists use as a potential sign of recession.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.